All right, hello everyone. Attempt number two. I hope you can all hear me and see me and that we're live this time. Sorry for the delay. We ran into some tech issues and hope that everything looks and sounds good right now. Welcome back to Big Bad Online 2024. My name is Indrani, and this talk is called Freelancing from the Global South. If you were not expecting this talk, stick around anyway, you might learn a thing or two. If not, I apologize. Before we jump into things, thank you so much, Imani, for producing this stream and William for moderating the chat. So, if you have any questions or comments and you leave them in the YouTube chat, um, William will very graciously drop them in a chat where I can see them and answer them. All right. First up, let's do some introductions. My name is Indrani. My pronouns are she, they. I am the studio head of Toronto Games. We're a game studio based out of Mumbai, India. We're working on our first narrative project right now. I am also a freelance game designer and marketer working with a variety of independent TTRPG as well as video game studios based out of the West, so primarily North America, Canada, all these places. Um, you might, I guess, the game that I work on right now that you might be familiar with is a game from Visai Games called Venba. And yeah, I have been working in the games industry for, I think, 4 to 5 years, and I have primarily been freelancing this whole time. So almost every position that I've had has been in a sort of contractual capacity. So this talk specifically is from that context, right? This talk is meant for people who currently do not live in the West, but are interested in working with the sort of more international games industry as freelancers or even as like as employees or whatnot. So we'll get into that in a bit. Um, but what I want to sort of establish is how we're approaching some of these conversations. So not every single slide here is like problem advice, problem advice. It's not necessarily like that. Some of these are takeaways that I've had, or like hard to swallow pills that I've had to come to terms with over my own career and journey. And some of these are more sort of harder, like, hey, these are things that I have found to be helpful. Maybe they'll be helpful for you as well. So, you know, take from this what seems applicable to you. Not all of this will be sort of one to one for your specific needs. All right. With that said, let's jump into the first slide. So, before you should know why there's Hindi text on the screen. This talk is one that I've done before for a different online, you know, set of panels called GameDev.world. They're more video game focused. And I did that talk in Hindi. And this one is going to be in English. And to sort of preserve the sort of global nature of this conversation, I figured I would leave these slides intact. Okay, that said, the first thing I want to talk about is working in games or choosing to work in games, right? It's a difficult thing to do, but it's not impossible. It's a difficult challenge, but it's not at all impossible. But what is important for us to keep in mind, I think, is that the stakes are just simply a lot higher for us, right? The barriers to entry are a lot more. So like, work people like to say that, oh, nobody works in games because it's lucrative. People do it because they love it. And at the scale that I work at, and I think at the scale that most people who might be listening to this or watching this work at, that's largely true. Nobody goes into games being like, yeah, I'm gonna get rich out of this. I'm gonna make all, like, nobody comes in with that. At least nobody that I've run into comes in with that mindset. Right? People largely work in games because we love it, right? And I think that love is, valuable and must be cherished and protected. But it also means that we're likely to sometimes make subpar decisions for ourselves because of our love for the craft, right? So this sort of separates the two a little bit. Um, know that every challenge of working in games in the West is a bigger challenge from the global South. You might be aware of like all of the layoffs that are happening in the industry right now, or like, the lack of jobs and the lack of job security. And you'll see a lot of people in the West talking about how it's really unsettling. And it is, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to take that away from anybody. But what I realized when I was listening to a lot of my peers talk about this, I was like, wait, this has been true for the global south for a much longer period of time. And that's not to say, woe is us, like, we have it worse or anything. It's just a sort of fact of how the industry's current layout is. Um, so the takeaway from this is not, it's not just, things are bad. It's that when you come into this, right, I think coming into it with intentionality is important. Now, what I mean by intentionality is that it's not enough to just love games. It's important to also know what exactly your career in games looks like, or what exactly you want it to look like, because it's never going to be exactly the same. But knowing where you want to go goes a long way in helping you make sort of decisions that are going to be uh, productive in making that happen. For example, some people might be more interested in doing contract work, right? Like, it's easier for, excuse me, sorry, it's easier for folks to be doing, contractual gigs and moving from, one opportunity to the other. But in that, they're trading off stuff like health insurance or like long-term job security, and they're doing it maybe because it gives them flexibility over their work hours, stuff like that. That's great. Some people are looking to make this their full-time, like primary one single paying source job. Now, I'll be honest, I came into the industry with that latter thing in mind. And before I started working on my own game studio and my own games, I tried very hard to make that happen, but I couldn't, not in the roles that I wanted, right? I didn't want to work in sort of tech or like, back endy kind of roles. I wanted to work in design and marketing, and those roles were not necessarily open to me. So I sort of gradually gravitated towards contractual based works. And largely yeah, all of the work that I've done in games has been contractual. So make of that what you will, and I guess set yourself up for success by knowing what the challenges are, and what you want, and like how those two things interact, I suppose. And that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The next slide is going to be a bit more like actionable, right? And this is, it seems like obvious advice when I put it out, like build a versatile portfolio. Yeah, great, and Gani, why though? I think there is, especially as global South creators, right? This is all in the context of us being sort of removed from the geographical games industry, at least the ones that like not, you know, not to discount local, work and communities, but like if we're working internationally, um, what one of the things that I often see people fall in the trap of is that they know what their niche is. So for me, I love a specific style of games and I love a specific style of writing, and I'm a marketer who gravitates towards certain styles of approaches, right? Certain approaches of marketing. That's great. Like I can have my personal preferences, but it's hard to communicate my breadth of skills that are not tied to my personal preferences if I don't have pieces in my portfolio showcasing those things. What I mean by that is, and this advice I think depends on what your specific field is and what your specific, uh, uh, kind of work is. So if you're working in art, this looks very different than if you're working in design. But having a variety of things that you can point towards as examples of your flexibility and as examples of your capability of doing multiple different things is, I think it goes a long way. So using TTRPGs as an example, right? Like you might be someone who really enjoys high fantasy and swords and sorcery, and that's great. But I think having your portfolio also showcase urban fantasy and also showcase, like, I don't know, magic girl TTRPGs, like having a variety of things in your portfolio will help you sort of like get the right sort of gigs, even though they might not necessarily be exactly what you're looking for. Because I don't think most of us find exactly what we're looking for, especially early on in our careers, right? So versatility is key because it closes a certain gap that we like geographically can't, right? Like when people are having in-person conversations and all of these things, and we'll get into that later. um, uh, it's easier to express that, hey, this is what I'm interested in, but I'm really good at this craft regardless, right? And that is much easier to sort of understand when you have that like cadence and conversation going, but not as much when you are someone who is trying to like be seen and heard from halfway across the world. So versatility in your work and a showcase of versatility in your work go a long way in finding work in the West. So that's the second thing I wanted to discuss. We're going to speed run these a little bit because we want to make sure that the next talk also happens in time despite our delays. So next up is, this is a fairly straightforward slide, and it basically means building relationships is better and more important and more useful and better for yourself and your community and your peers and your coworkers than networking. I think networking can be this like dirty word, right? People think of networking like, oh, it's slimy. Somehow it's I'm trying to get something out of you, or you're trying to get something out of me. And honestly, there is a small element of that, right? Like, and when you meet people in professional spaces, you don't always meet people with the intention of, oh, we're going to be buddies, we're two folks in the industry who are going to be talking about things or stuff like that. You meet with the intention of, oh, we could work together, and there is an inherent transactional nature to that, and that's okay. I think the first step in understanding what I mean here is being okay with that part of networking. um, but I think what's important is fostering actual genuine relationships. um, the reason this slide is important though is because it's way way harder to do when you're not at these physical conventions or conferences and rubbing shoulders and shaking the right hands and whatnot. I hate how useful those things are. Like, and I say this as someone, so I work with Big Bad Con on the POC programming team. I've been doing it for the last 2 years, and um, a lot of our work revolves around like flying incredible scholars from the global south out, so that we can have that, we can bridge that sort of geographical gap for them. But for every person who does have that opportunity, there are like hundreds of people who don't, right? And this is specifically for the folks who don't have that space. What does building relationships in a digital space look like? Unfortunately, I guess for better or for worse, I think social media goes a long way in this, right? Um, and I think there's this bit, right? Every person who wants to work right now has to become a content creator, and I see the truth in that. I'm not advocating for it at all, but I do think that as folks who are um, geographically separated from a lot of these opportunities, the way we make ourselves known, the way we make ourselves um, feel seen and present and heard is by existing in communities, right? Is by existing online. So I think investing some time and effort into what that looks like for you is important. Not everyone is going to want to have a thriving social media account, or like, I don't know, post art updates daily. Like, not everybody is has that like hustle mindset almost, and I think that's a good thing. But what does your version of presenting yourself online look like? For some of us, people will have their own substacks, right? They'll have their own newsletters where they're talking about their design ethos, or they're talking about like the kind of work they're interested in, or review, whatever that looks like, right? For some people it is using social media, for others it's finding communities, and we'll specifically talk about finding communities in a bit. But find what your comfort level is when it comes to being visible, right? Like, whatever your way of being visible is, find it and use it, because you're going to need it. No, I can think of all the jobs that I've gotten, right? Disregarding my earliest ones, I have gotten because somebody knows me and somebody recommended me, right? And that's the unfortunate sort of ugly truth about these things, is that like just merit, like people say this a lot, right? In order to like make it, it's like this intersection of luck and opportunity and and skill, right? Like you can have all the skill in the world, but there is a level of luck involved, there is a level of opportunity involved, and you can increase your space for opportunity, your chances for opportunities by being visible, right? And no work that I've gotten that has been like, you know, good and valuable and fundamentally like important to my career has come from like cold applying or from strangers. It's come because someone knows me and the work I do and thought that I might be a good fit for a role. And in order to foster those kind of things, I had to be visible online. And I had to be visible in a meaningful way, right? That comes back to the whole relationships versus networking thing. I think that it's harder to build. These like impactful long lasting relationships over the internet, and I'm not saying like be everybody's best friend or whatever, but I am saying that like working with your peers and like building community with your peers and interacting with folks, not just people who are ahead of you but people who are also beside you and behind you in their careers, um, goes a long way in fostering those relationships, right? I've had moments where I find a really great role but I cannot take it on, but I'm like, oh, someone I know who's at the similar skill set as me is really cool. I know them just from the internet, but I've interacted with them enough, I've seen their work enough, and I can recommend them for the job, right? And that comes because we're not just looking forwards. I think networking becomes very transactional when you're always looking forwards, right? When you're always looking at, oh, you're the person who can hire me, so I'll interact with you. But when you're not looking at the people who you are sort of coming up with, right? So yeah, those are a few things I think to keep in mind about relationships versus networking and how they factor into being a creator from the global south. All right. So next up is we're going back to like one of those more zoomed out harder truth things, which is working in a silo is extremely isolating, I think. And as people who work primarily remotely, um, it's a very easy trap to fall into. I work from home. My living situation is very sort of the work I do during my day hours, and I'm interacting for a little bit with the people I work with. Uh, at like strange hours for me because I live in India, right? So the time zones are very very different, right? Like usually there's a 10-hour, 6-hour, 8-hour gap between me and the people I'm working with. What this means like for me is that it can often lead me to feel like I'm working with nobody, right? Games are I think at the scale that I'm talking about right now, which is still fairly small, they're a collaborative process, right? These games that we're making are being made because we're working with other people, where there's different people involved, and that makes those games richer. What I think makes these games better and makes any game that we're working on better is an idea of kinship with the people we're making games with, and that's I think harder to achieve primarily because of time zone differences, but also because of the nature of like being freelancers in this industry, right? Like it's often like, oh, I'm going to do my own thing and I'm going to hand it off, and that's going to be the extent of it. But I like to push back against that wherever I work, right? So if I'm working, for example, when I started working with Visai Games, I was the first thing I was like, hey, I am happy to do the marketing for you, but I would like to also meet the rest of the team. I would like to get to know them a little bit. And at first, it was like a little bit of a weird request. They were like, okay, uh, I you don't fully see why, but of course. And knowing the team and their personalities and what they're interested in, what makes them laugh, what makes them, feel, emotionally moved, almost informs the work that I do as their marketing person. I don't know how to quite explain that, but what I'm trying to say is it's important to build relationships with the people you're working with outside of like your deliverables and the scope of your work, if that makes sense. Um, all right, we're coming up at okay. So we have one more important sort of slide to go, and then we can do some questions if there are any. Okay. Um, so this one again is a broad category, right? This one, I'm calling it know your value. And this, okay, let's unpack this. What I mean here is that there is this gratefulness syndrome, is what I like to call it. I think often we can fall in the trap of like, oh, I know that working in games is difficult. I know that, the opportunities that I'm receiving or the opportunities that I have access to are already very hard to come by. And the fact that I have access to them, I am so, so grateful that I have access to them. And I think gratefulness is a good trait in people. I don't think that we should be ungrateful ever. But I think people from the global south may have a tendency to be more grateful than we necessarily need to be in certain situations. People are working with you because they like your work. They think that whatever you are doing or you can do is going to bring value to them, their company, their product, right? At the end of the day, what you're doing is providing a service, you're providing something of value that makes their end product better. That's the bottom line when you're working, right? So the gratefulness syndrome, I think, makes it feel like, oh, I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. And that idea can often lead to a lot of you make choices, or you make allowances that are not in your favor as a human being, because you're feeling grateful that, oh, I'm glad I get to do this at all. For me, a very, very easy example is that there was a time where I would be taking meetings at 3 a.m. my time, because I was like, oh, of course I want to make it easy for people who are awake and it's their completely normal work hours, because I can't believe they're working with me. I'm so grateful that I get to work with them. Of course, I don't want to inconvenience them. And the thing is, working globally makes people's games better, right? But it's also more work. Like, it's more emotional labor, it's more like management labor, and all of those things are true, right? So there has to be an intersection, right? So people have to try to meet each other halfway. Now, if you're constantly bending over backwards, people will assume that that's okay for them to ask those things of you, right? If So what I'm trying to say here is, don't do that, right? Set boundaries. Realize that, yes, it's very cool that we're getting to do what we're getting to do, 100%. Don't get me wrong, but it's also important to know that it's nobody's doing you a favor, right? Nobody's ever done me a favor. Nobody's ever going to do you a favor. At the end of the day, if money's coming into your bank account, that's because people think your work will make their product better. Keep that in mind when you're making concessions, right? Whether it's as simple as time zones, is really as simple as that. It's like, for me, one of the things I had to learn is that, okay, I physically cannot be doing meetings at like some ungodly hour my time, and also making sure all my working hours overlap with theirs. Like, that's often a requirement that I'll see, and I'll be like, why? Right? I can work during my daytime, and I can have specific hours during the day that I carve out to make sure we're talking with each other. um, uh, but I'm not going to be awake through the night just because that's when the rest of the team is awake. Like, if the job doesn't need that, then why is it being asked of you, is a question to ask. um, it can also Knowing your value is also very, very important when it comes to pay parity. Now, not very long ago, I was at a role where I was doing the exact same work as someone else, and I was being paid, say, 30% of what they were. Yeah. So when the reason I found out is because I was having conversations with my peer, right? And we were talking about, oh yeah, works great and all, pay is a little strange for me. And they were like, oh, interesting, okay. And that conversation opened up my eyes to the fact that, oh, right, there is this idea that because if you're working with as a freelancer with folks in the West, you're earning in dollars, you're earning in a currency that might not be your local currency. And often that works out in at least in my case, it has worked out in my favor, right? Because of the sort of currency differences. um, the cost of living in your part of the world may be different from the cost of wherever the company is based out of. And often you will see companies be like, oh, when they'll pay freelancers from the global south, the rates will sort of differ based on geographical considerations. And that's okay. I'm not saying pay, like, get paid as much as a Silicon Valley person gets paid for the same, like, okay, that's unrealistic, right? Like, I'm not saying you should expect that or want that. But what I am saying is that there is a line uh, between being severely underpaid and being paid a sort of a equal amount to what is expected for your region. And I think you should be aware, like, do your research and finding out what that is, and do your research and finding out that the place you're working at isn't underpaying you because it's easier to do so and they get away with it, um, uh, per se, right? So pay parity, time zones, all of these things, a lot of this really comes down to like dignity. Sorry, I'm like really sick. Uh, so I think protecting your dignity and protecting your value and knowing what you're worth is very important when you're freelancing. I think don't fall for the gratefulness syndrome. Like it's fine. Nobody's doing you a favor. Okay. And yeah, we should start wrapping soon. That's the last thing I had to say. Um, I will be around answering some questions. I have some from chat right now, but these are different ways of reaching me if you want to keep the conversation going. I'll also be on the Discord server for a little bit, having chats after this. Okay, questions. Did it take long for me to see my portfolio building and relationship building start to pay off? Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, right. I think the earlier work that I was doing was very um, it didn't feel like all of the work that I was putting into sort of making myself um, present and my work available to people was sort of coming through until like almost year and a half, 2 years into my sort of freelancing journey in games. So the answer is yes, it took a long time, but when I started to see that payoff happening, right, it felt so rewarding and it felt so I think it felt appropriate to the amount of investment that I had put into it, right? I think that seeing it pay off can mean a lot of different things for different people, right? For me, seeing it pay off was the first time somebody recommended me for a job. I was like, oh shit, like I didn't expect to have that happen. Like I always thought that I was like this lone wolf based out of Bombay who's going to have to find all the opportunities for herself. But that wasn't true. Like I had people in my life now suddenly who were rooting for me, despite never having met me in person, and I thought that was pretty interesting. So yes, but it was, I think, worth it. Hopefully that answers your question. Happy to elaborate. Um, we have one more question, which is building relationships seems like a key step, but social media can often be overwhelming. Would it be possible to do the same through Discord, perhaps? Yes. Okay. So I think Discord fundamentally is a different kind of social media platform. I think it's more of like a community building platform than like a sort of meet new people on the fly kind of place, right? So I don't think it's exactly a replacement, but I think it can do the same job in a good enough kind of way. Um, what I mean by this is, so for example, let's use India as an example. There are certain communities based out of India that I found really, really um, helpful in my own journey as a game developer and a freelancer. So these are communities that were specifically for local people, but also like global communities that I like. I joined the servers, I started meeting people, but again, social media is overwhelming because of like there's so much coming at you and there's so much you feel like you're shouting into a void. But with Discord spaces, especially ones that have a certain amount of people in it, it can kind of feel the same, right? So it still requires that sort of like emotional investment in that, okay, I need to give back to this community. I need to like engage with it and not treat it as like a transactional space. And in order for that community to accept me as one of their own, right? So yeah, I think Discord is a good alternative, but I do recommend seeking out like a good mix of like local as well as international communities that you can be a part of. I hope that also answers your question. All right, if there are no more questions, we'll give it another minute. I think we'll wrap. We're 10 minutes early, which I'm, look at us, but yeah, I think we can. Cool. I don't think we have any questions. So once again, thank you so much for joining this particular talk. I hope that it was insightful or useful for some of you. I will be on the Big Bad Online 2024 Discord server. So if you haven't registered, please register. You'll find the link to it. Talking to people about the specific talk. I'm talking in general. So hop on over if you would like. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to Big Bad Online for giving me the space to have this conversation. Okay, I'm gonna now be here until we're ready to go. Bye.